Hey everyone, and welcome back to Fine Print. This week, we're covering Unit 2 of the APUSH Review Series. If you haven't checked out our first episode where we covered Unit 1 of APUSH, be sure to go check that out. Period 2 covers the time period between 1607 and 1754. The Period 3 episode will be releasing sometime next week, so be sure to be looking out for that. Until then, let's get started with Period 2 of APUSH. Before going to the material that's covered in Period 2, it is important to realize Spanish, French, and English relations in native lands during this time period. The Spanish mostly lived in Mexico, present-day Arizona, Texas, and California. Their economy was largely based on labor and mine workers, and they converted many natives to Christianity. Their relationship with the Native Americans was hostile and unfriendly. They also implemented the encomienda system, which was a restrictive labor system that was incorporated in Spanish imperialism. The French mostly lived in inland North America and along the St. Lawrence River. Their economy relied on the fur trade and on the weapon trade. Their relationship with Native Americans was by far one of the most peaceful relationships any European country has had with natives. The English mostly settled in a variety of colonies in Canada and along the Atlantic coast in the Americas. They were mostly families and men that migrated to America that came from England, and they came here for better lives and religious freedom. Their relationship with the Native Americans was initially peaceful. However, it soon became hostile as the English began to take over native lands in the Americas. It is also important to understand the definition of salutatory neglect, which is when European countries neglected the colonies that they had in the Americas that led to the colonies developing largely independently. This also fueled the American Revolution, as the colonies believed that England had no say over what they were doing back here in the Americas. Geography also impacted the different attitudes of Europeans. The French were surrounded by different countries and were used to diversity back home. However, Spain and England were not, which is why they had more hostile relations with the natives. In North America, there were three main groups of colonies that were founded during this time period: the Southern colonies, the New England colonies, and the Middle colonies. Firstly, the Southern colonies consisted of Georgia, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Maryland. They had a plantation economy which was dependent on tobacco, rice, and indigo as their main cash crops. Expansionist desires grew from the need for fresh land to compensate for soil depletion. They also followed an aristocracy, where wealthy landowners had power over indentured servants and slaves. Slavery in the Americas also began during this time period and was spurred by a need for labor. The southern colonies were sparsely populated. Churches and schools weren't as important, which is why they were religiously tolerant. The southern colonies were the only colonies that were religiously tolerant. However, the Anglican Church was the most prominent. Next were the New England colonies. These colonies consisted of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. Their purpose for settlement was quite different from southern colonies. They wanted religious freedom and thus founded a theocracy, a government based on religion. There were two groups of people that migrated to the Americas from Europe. First were the Puritans. They wanted to purify the church and came to Massachusetts Bay Colony under John Winthrop. The second group were Pilgrims. They were separatists who wanted to separate from the Anglican Church. They were the ones who created the Mayflower Compact on their journey to the Americas. It was the first basis of democracy in the New World. The residents of the New England colonies largely supported education and religion and valued community life, as many migrated in families. Trade and shipping were very common as they lived very close to the harbor. Lastly were the Middle colonies, which were New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. The Middle colonies were founded for a blending of reasons, economic and religious. They were ethnically diverse and mostly followed an aristocracy. However, there were some forms of democracy present in the Middle colonies. These colonies were also known as the breadbasket colonies, as they produced the largest agricultural output in the Americas during the time period. The Quakers also lived in this area of the Americas. Namely, William Penn believed that everyone had a sliver of God in them, and thus were called the Quakers. There were three main terms that are very important to know for Period 2, and specifically for the development of the colonies in the Americas. first was the Mayflower Compact. The Pilgrims signed the first form of self-government in New England, and it laid the foundation that America would be ran by Americans and not by a monarchy. Second was the Maryland Toleration Act. It allowed all types of Christians to come into Maryland and protected Catholics from the rage of Protestants. Third were the House of Burgesses. It was formed in Virginia in 1619 and was the first democratically elected legislative body in the world. Another important concept in Period 2 of AP US history was the triangular trade. Although it was called the triangular trade as it's believed to have occurred between the Americas, Africa, and Europe, it also included the West Indies, which definitely makes it a four-way trade. There are some notable goods, services, and diseases that are important to know in the triangular trade. Namely, from Europe to the Americas were manufactured goods. From the Americas to Europe were lumber, fur, fish, iron, gunpowder, tobacco, rice, and indigo. From the Americas to Africa were rum, iron, and gunpowder. From Africa to the West Indies were slaves, gold, and pepper. From the West Indies to the Americas were slaves, and from the Americas to the West Indies were flour and fish. You don't need to memorize all of them for the AP exam, but it's definitely important to know how Africa, West Indies, the Americas, and Europe all facilitated this trade during this period. As mentioned before, salutatory neglect, or the reduced British intervention in colonial affairs, led the colonies to grow accustomed to self-rule. They inconsistently used mercantilist policies, which made it seem unfair to the Americans that the monarchy that was so far away was still exerting control on the colonies. This led to three impactful things that might be important for the AP exam. First was the Dominion of New England. It tried to unite New England into a single economic unit, so it would be easier for the monarchy to tax them. Second were the Navigation Acts. They stated that colonial imports and exports would only be with England, and smuggling with other countries was making British opponents rich. The last one was the Wool Act. It prohibited wool export from the colonies to protect British wool farmers. These three separate results of the salutatory neglect that was happening during this time period all led to smuggling with other countries. During this time period, another important concept to understand for the AP exam was the Great Awakening. The Christian Church had split into the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox branch during the Great Schism in Europe. Then, the Roman Catholic branch split into the Protestants and the Catholics, which led to many Protestants migrating to the Americas. Combined, this split in the Christian Church and the Roman Catholic branch led to the Enlightenment, which was a period of time in Europe that emphasized reasoning and science over blind religious tolerance. One notable individual during the Enlightenment was John Locke. He believed in natural rights, namely life, liberty, and property. These three concepts were implemented into the American Declaration of Independence, where we mentioned life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The concept of the consent of the governed also arose during this time period and stated that the people had the power to overthrow an unjust government. The Enlightenment largely gave rise to the Declaration of Independence in America after American victory in the American Revolution. Thomas Jefferson was namely quite inspired by John Locke and his idea of natural rights. However, as the Enlightenment thinking began to rise and people began to value reasoning and science more than religion, there was a key movement that happened in America, also known as the first mass social movement in America, namely the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was a religious movement in the Americas that largely rejected rationalism in favor of religion. Two key individuals in the Great Awakening were Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Edwards delivered emotional sermons that pushed away rationalism brought by the Enlightenment and brought emotional thinking to the Americas. George Whitefield traveled the countryside instead of having his own church to spread the message of revivalism across the Americas. And that's it for Period 2 of AP US History. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to stay tuned for next week, where we will be bringing Unit 3, where we covered the American Revolution and the events that happened after it. If you haven't checked out Unit 1's review episode yet, be sure to go check that out on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Until then, keep reading between the lines and keep following Fine Print for more episodes.